Hello and welcome to Back to the Future of Interiors with me, James McLaughlin, editor of Car Design News. Now, a lot has changed in the last 2 decades of interior design. Historically, production car interiors were judged on comfort, ergonomics, functionality with a palette of tried and tested materials. However, it's fair to say in terms of hierarchy, the exterior of the car was seen as a bit more important. Advances in technology, sustainability and changing powertrains have repositioned the car interior at the cutting edge of innovation, a space which affords far greater design freedom than at any point in history. These developments have brought with them a whole raft of requirements in terms of design skills. UX designers, for example, are now key fields in the development of any new car. Materials are changing too. While concerns about the environment were present 20 years ago, the issue now leads most design conversations. It's forcing a reappraisal of everything from supply chains to definitions of luxury. Today, you're as likely to find flax competing interior space alongside recycled PET bottles in an aggressive concept car. Indeed, materials themselves are subject to technological innovation, with smart surfaces offering a more seamless HMI. While the rise of EVs affords greater opportunities to reconfigure internal space, autonomous driving technology still yet to make its impact truly felt. Promises a multi-modal interior with endless possibilities. Now, to coincide with the relaunch of influential interior design magazine, Interior Motives, we have invited a select panel to reflect on how interiors have changed over the last 20 years, reflect on where are we now, and look ahead to the next 20. And they are Brian Nesbitt, Executive Director of Global Cadillac Design, Elizabeth Wetzel, Co-Director of the Transport Design Department at the College of Architecture and Design at Lawrence Technological University, and Peter Horbury, VP of Design at Lotus. Welcome everyone, and well, yes, welcome to the webinar. Now, Peter, I'm going to start with you, if that's all right. I'm sure you won't mind me describing you as the elder statesman, perhaps, in this little select group we've pulled together. But I've been speaking to a few design directors about sort of the rise of interiors, or the last 20 years of interiors, and I'd like to quote you actually. Anko Lennart, so I'm sure you know, is the design director of Ford Europe, and I asked him for his recollections of when he started working in interiors. And if I quote him, he said, "Remembering my first job as the only interior designer at a large OEM, interior design was jokingly referred to as inferior design. We worked on desks made out of old doors on trestles with full ashtrays, the only sign of the creative juices flowing." Is this a scenario you recognize from that era?
It's absolutely true, I'm afraid. Inferior design is something we called it. Yeah, but of course we realize that it's a very important part of the work. But I remember when I actually left Chrysler UK and joined Ford, and the only executive who was there that day to welcome me was the head of color materials, and he just grabbed me and took me to that department and sat me at a desk. And I protested, hey, listen, I'm an exterior designer, for Christ's sake. But I have to say, having done that and then into interiors, it prepared me far better for my roles in the future. Of course, you can't just stick with one, even if exteriors were the sort of the rock stars, and interiors were, the orchestra musicians, let's say. Anyway, it's long gone, that period, or that thought.
Yes, long gone, Liz. But again, I suppose is this. I mean, you started in interior design a few years ago, around the same time actually as Interior Motives launched as a magazine, I believe. But doors on trestles as desks. The rock stars with the exteriors, was that something you felt at the beginning of your career?
Oh yes. Definitely. We would set up design reviews for leadership to come in, and they would wander in the studio and go right to the exterior and then leave. Which, you know what, in some cases that was good because we had the freedom to do what we wanted. But in other cases it wasn't, because we were not afforded the budget or the head count or the support, really, to take interiors to the potential that they had. We knew that interiors were important to the whole customer experience. As an interior designer, we knew that, and we felt a bit neglected. And yeah, so I did very much experience that in the beginning of my career.
And Brian, I suppose same question to you. I suspect I know what the answer is going to be. You were slightly marginalized figures, but
yeah, it's I mean, it's great to see now, but I recall specifically when I arrived in Rüsselsheim at Opel, and they were taking me through the studios, and there was no interior studio, and the interior IP and door panel and console were stuck in a corner. And if you recall the interiors back in those days, they didn't receive a lot of attention, actually. And there was no dedicated space. There was no dedicated resource. They had a small color and trim office with some color frogs and some material. But yeah, we ended up going in and having to create all of that resource and space. And because it was really quite a testament to the lack of attention in that part of the area. And ironically, it's where you spend all your time, right? So
yes,
yeah.
And it does sound quite astonishing to hear about these sort of recollections today, given how important the interior has become. But was there sticking with you, Brian, just in terms of recruiting talent, was it hard to find good interiors people, or was it people who not quite made the sort of glamour, the show pony of the exterior, and they were sort of consolation prize?
Just like Peter was mentioning, and Liz, you found there was an industrial design base through the academy systems and universities, and then the supply base itself, where especially your large suppliers, and you could source talent from there, but yeah, there was a lack of glamour to it, a lack of exposure, and therefore a lack of marketability to a lot of those posts. And yeah, so it's come a long way.
It sure has. And it's not saying for a moment that you were one of the consolation prize people.
Yeah, I did come through industrial design, as Brian said. That was my degree, and I think the other problem was the automotive design schools were not really focusing on interior design. So the talent just wasn't there to begin with, and the focus wasn't there to begin with. So yeah, and so as Brian said, most of the talent came from industrial design background or suppliers.
I have to say, when you hear designers talk about their school books being full of car designs, I don't suppose any of them featured interiors.
So it's true, and I remember, Peter, you saying that you got interested in car design when your father showed you how to do a sort of a geometrical technique of drawing a car, not in profile but in sort of three-quarter view. I think that's correct.
There was a very, very simple. He drew a bus, and then he put a line just in front of the front line, and then a little bit of wheel in front of the wheel, and suddenly the whole thing turned into a very crude perspective, and it became real. And that was a real revelation to me. So.
But interesting that the revelation had come from the exterior, like you say, rather than the sort of inspired by the steering wheel, the IP. You studied at the RCA in 68 to 70. Was it around 72?
I joined in 72 and left in 74. Yeah.
And I suppose was there much? Was there much of a focus on the interior back then, or was that just as Liz said? No, okay.
No, not really.
So Liz, going to you with your sort of the early projects that you worked on. What were the key? We talk about interiors these days is in terms of connectivity and UX and sustainability. But what if you're looking back to what made a good interior then, was it the stuff that I sort of listed at the start there, to talk about ergonomics and functionality and things like that? Because you did pick up some awards quite early in your career for interiors. I'm thinking about the Pontiac Solstice and the HHR. I just wondered what made a good interior then?
Yes, well, what made a good interior is, like you said, it was more about functionality, and projecting the brand. But at that time, early on, the cost allocation still wasn't there to provide the materials that we thought we needed to really pull off a great design. Perceived quality was just starting to come into play as an important part of interior design. Before that, because of the fact that interior design was not so much a priority, we would see suppliers take our surface that we would, work on and perfect and hand over to them to make the tools, and they would change the surface. I mean, it was so out of control because there was no oversight by leadership. But at that point in time that you're talking about, perceived quality started to become a major focus. Functionality was key, ergonomics was key. So it was all about more functionality than design. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the brand really started to become a key element of the design focus and how to differentiate the brands. In fact, Brian came to GM at that time and was head of the Chevrolet brand. And each of the heads of the brands started to really define what each brand should be. And that really helped the designers to focus and make sure that their designs really relayed a certain value system, a certain aesthetic that went with that value system. Before, it was just like whatever is the latest trend is what everybody was doing, not necessarily what is best for the brand or the customer.
That's really interesting. Brian, does that resonate with you, what Liz was saying there about this idea that the brand had been secondary to sort of trends, I suppose?
Yeah, I think there was just, I think it goes back to this maybe overall kind of maybe lack of attention, lack of value for that part of the experience. And yet, as we all know, that's where you spend your time and you make those judgments over 30 days, 3 months, a year. And you grow to appreciate the good decisions, and you, of course, are very, very discerning in what decisions weren't made very well and how things function, how things integrate. But the complexity of the interior, I think, is something that wasn't really appreciated to that extent. A lot was pushed off into the supply base, to Liz's point. And then, well, we changed this, we changed that, we can't manufacture it this way, we can't make it that way, so we'll just change all this to accommodate the manufacturing. I think more appreciation of what is customer facing and how to release that, integrate it and release it, has been a long journey, I think, for the organization. And I think that was coupled with maybe some other exterior metrics that were being prioritized, JD Power, et cetera, that more emphasis on fit and finish. And then there was I think some greater appreciation with leadership on material and to Liz's point, maybe let's say a total budget for the interior that just wasn't really a priority in discussions all the time.
Peter, sort of picking up on Brian there, was this kind of this key change moment, was it happening around the same time that you were working? So you probably were a bit further on in your career at that point than.
Yeah, but I think we have to look back even further than my time to see where the emphasis was, because even in the 1930s and 40s, where the car exterior started to take on varying shapes depending on brand. Inside, there were flat pieces of hardboard covered perhaps in a plastic on the doors, and a window winder and a door handle. And in front was a flat plank of wood with holes drilled in for instruments. The only three-dimensional objects were the seats, and they were sort of pieces of furniture, more or less. So the simplicity of the interior lasted far longer than the complexities of exterior design that started to appear. It was a long time before the interior changed from that very basic things. I mean, I still remember what they called door cards, which was that vinyl covered hardboard. The most you'd get was a U-shaped armrest door pull, screwed in, visible screws,
bolted in.
And yeah, a chrome door release and a window winder with enough room to get your hand in a full circle a number of times. So it was a long time before shape started to appear on the interior.
Yeah, it was part of the evolution, right? This is all the evolution of the automobile, as you're pointing out, Peter, right? Really,
Yeah.
it was all the exterior in the beginning, and now that technology and features and so on are enabling the interior to become more of an experience, it's really shifting.
It is interesting. I was at the. Sorry, was that you, Brian, that wanted to jump in there?
No, I was
feel free
on that point. I think one of the things I recall at least was when that original A4 came out, and the fit and finish and the dimensional quality was so high for that segment of vehicle, and I have to say it triggered a lot relative to benchmarking that helped really reposition that vehicle. And that vehicle, particularly, it was a really big part of their rebuilding the brand. But it was the interior that stood out the most. And I can remember salivating over how well done it was, how well it was executed, and the quality and the material and the fit and finish. And so that, I think, was a turning point for the industry. I think that influenced a lot of the industry, was my impression.
Yeah, I agree. Audi was really setting the benchmark. They were the ones that we would look at and benchmark and say, how did they do this? This is incredible.
Yeah,
and especially back then, because we were arguing a lot of things like, the manufacturing come back, well, you got to put these big dumb hose radiuses on these parts so that we don't have to manage. We can put a lot of gravy in the slip, and that was kind of very, very generous kind of slip plane criteria, stuff like that. That now, once there was, I think that made such an impression, and it's been positive for the whole industry.
And Brian, talking about your own work, I mentioned it in the conversation just before we started the broadcast, and we were talking about, well, one of your probably your most famous kind of project was a PT Cruiser, and it's a car that still, I saw one yesterday on the street, and just by coincidence, and it's still very striking. It's very hard to ignore as an exterior designer. There it is, and but it's obviously the conversation. Obviously, something it tends to orbit around the exterior, but you were saying that interior was where you really scored a few big wins in terms of getting
such yeah, because we were intentionally trying to do a taller package, a chair seat, so you're H to heel, much more comfortable, a more chair-like seating position. That created a taller package. We were very influenced by the European packages happening at the time of the 5 doors. And then, they allowed us to do a lot of functionality. So the passenger side seat flopped down. I'd done an original sketch of kind of, this retrospective kind of interior, as you can imagine, where, we look at a lot of cars and you just want to kind of clean them up a little bit. It's like, well, if I could have just radiused this and put some surface on this, and could have used a different material here. And I really wanted that, 8-ball gear shift, and on just kind of a single chrome rod, and we had a lot of freedom there. So it was a lot of those original ideation. We were able, and the interior team kind of took all that work, and so there's a lot of functionality that I think we were surprised that we were able to accomplish, and the team did a great job.
Peter, moving to you actually, because part of the reason for this broadcast is to sort of highlight the relaunch of Interior Motors, which is the 20 years anniversary this year. It's coming back as a print product twice a year, which we're very, very excited about. But your concept for the Volvo was the first ever cover of Interior Motors. Which it's not that long ago, but it was the Adventure Concept Car 2. Now, I had some really interesting ideas around it, because ostensibly on the exterior it was a sort of a V70, a very handsome station wagon or state car, depending on which side of the pond you are. But the interior was where you really kind of pushed the boundaries. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what you were trying to achieve with that project.
Well, that car was meant to be for the winter, let's say. It was when you leave Sweden, most people turn south to go skiing into Europe, but you can turn north and go up into the wilds. And that car was meant to be a sort of survival kit, part of the survival kit, to turn north into a much colder, slightly bleaker. It wasn't the alpine resorts, but it was something to keep you warm, keep you safe, and you could take an awful lot of stuff. The picture shows the stackable seats, let's say, where they were on rails that moved all the way to the front, the rear seats. So it was a truck or a van as much as it was a car, but it was all to do with this going north for the winter. And in fact, the underside of the car was painted bright orange, just in case you flipped it. And helicopters could find you. That was
That's
that
awesome.
was the whole idea. That we thought very hard about how could you enjoy a trek north rather than go to the obvious ski resorts in the Alps. That was the adventure part of it. Yeah.
But it also had you explored ideas of connectivity as well, because you were going to get sort of snow reports and things like that beamed into the car. And
yes, absolutely, and of course the safety part, it being a Volvo, meant that you could be found. Let's say you could be in touch. All these things we take for granted today, and this is 20 years ago. It was quite a breakthrough, the technology that we put in that car.
Yeah, and these are the this is the nascent sort of beginnings, I suppose, of this idea of the connected car, Liz. And I know you were deeply immersed, or still are deeply immersed in sort of user experience. Just before we get to that, I think one thing I'd like to, I haven't sort of put this in my notes, but Peter, talking about this kind of idea of this, this sort of survival mobile and all that, designed with a very, very specific geographic location in mind. And I wondered whether that is a tool, a design tool, the idea of being inspired by place, how useful that has been and how that has been picked up in terms of interior design. Liz, maybe I'll start with you and then to you, Brian.
As far as a place?
Yes.
Well, I think what's happening is, what we're going to see is the ability to have, and I'm excited about the ability to have more diversity in the marketplace as far as what products are going to do and how they're going to serve different customers and brands. I hope we don't see a formulaic trend happening. I hope we see more diversity that is going to enable more customization, more specific use scenarios like what Peter was just talking about, where in the future, I think, because electrification and the simplification of the automobile that's happening right now, we're going to see the ability to have more specified type of vehicles. And there's going to be a greater bandwidth, I think, as far as from luxury to entry level. I think we're going to see a much larger bandwidth of opportunity there than what we see today.
Mm-hmm. And Peter, actually, maybe we'll just jump back to you, because I know we've spoken as well in the past about how you location inspired design, if you like, or regional. Just maybe you could speak a little bit to it, because you've expanded these ideas, explored these ideas at Volvo, but also at Geely Group in China. Maybe how that can inform an interesting or persuasive.
Well, I've always been a fan of the location or the country of origin having an influence on the design, and therefore creating a much more interesting mix of cars on offer to the customer. An Alfa Romeo could only come out of Italy, and Citroëns had their Frenchness complete. They lost it a bit maybe in the 80s, but they got it back, thankfully. And you know, the old solid Mercedes-Benz was quite Germanic, and long may they stay somewhat true to their origins. We had a very interesting time for the last 10, 11 years creating Geely's and the other brands, wondering just how much of a Chinese influence we could bring to the table. And you know, there are ways of doing it subtly, and there are ways of doing it pretty obviously. And I think it's perhaps best, if you want to export, that you don't go too far. You know, I had a nice story actually when we showed the concept car for the big sedan back in 2013, I think it was. We'd used Chinese elements in the design, but they were mostly on the interior. We were visited on our stand in Shanghai Auto Show by two members of the Chinese Politburo, two ministers, standing in their overcoats, very straight, and they'd heard that there was Chinese designs involved in the car. And I said, well, they're mostly on the inside. So I opened the driver's door to offer them, you know, to get in, but they just stood there. And an embarrassing minute passed, and I realized. So I opened the rear door, and they got in. There's no way they were going to sit in the servants' quarter.
And that's actually,
yeah, we did use Chinese elements in that car. But I think if you go back to Volvo, and in the early days, or when I joined them, the 240, you couldn't have switches close to each other, for example, because in the northern parts of Sweden, at 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning, the farmer goes out, he expects to start his Volvo and operate it, and he's not there barehanded. He's got massive gloves. So there was a term we had to use, the Swedish gloved hand. And therefore, you know, you had to be able to operate one switch and not the next either side of it. So there are practical things that come out of the country of origin, let's say, or the culture.
That's a great example. To your point, brings a lot of character, or an opportunity for character. I think that original Volvo concept too, I think that I've often used destination as the brief to help build the user case to then drive different ideas around what solutions can deliver on that destination, and maybe invite more ideation around unique user cases that would help us kind of identify either unique interfaces or different solution sets around the interior. And I've always found that quite compelling as a brief.
And just picking up slightly on Peter's point about the diplomats unwilling, or the Politburo unwilling to get into the front of the car, it does. Interiors were historically about, centered around the driver. That was the person you really thought about most. They were the people who were going to be controlling the thing. We're at a very different moment now, where advances in technology are making it possible to think about a much more universal experience for the passengers, basically. And Brian, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that change.
Well, it's a big change, and there's a lot of promise of autonomy, right? And so the different studies and exploration around those opportunities, and whether it's around the corner or much farther into the end of the decade, we've spent a lot of time working on our autonomous taxi, the Cruise Origin, with our partners in San Francisco, and all that's led to a lot more, I think, ideation and kind of internal study work on, well, what are the next steps relative to kind of retail solution sets. And you think about the lost time, especially in the big Lux markets, for instance. Typically the biggest Lux markets are also the ones that are the most congested. And now post-pandemic, the 405 in LA, the 10, they're all back to 25, 30 mile an hour average between 6 and 8 a.m. And you've got people that are typically living, commuting quite far because of the price of housing, et cetera. So that's all lost time, and globally lost time on the roads. And so, how can you reclaim that time, maybe repurpose, get value out of that, whether it's downtime, you want to maybe, if I could, the promise of, wow, could I really actually take a nap on the way home, and how profound that could be. and in the morning, could I start my day even earlier in that commute if I have a commute? So all those ideas, and then what are the solutions to enable them, and hopefully align that with the hardware and tech integration and the software to enable it. So we've been studying a lot of that over the years relative to our investments in EV and AV, and it's an exciting, it's kind of this frontier of opportunity, and we see a lot of solution sets on the way there. But once that opens up into it could create a lot of opportunity. At the same time, we still, as I know Liz and Peter know, we still have a lot of safety to consider. And so this idea of how to manage safety along with all the things that people think of as the true dream and vision of being kind of chauffeured around by your own personal vehicle. So there's a lot to integrate, a lot to comprehend, but it is one of the most exciting things to be considering.
And Liz, just dialing back slightly, I'm interested in the sort of beginnings of this idea of user experience, because now it seems to be, it dominates the conversation, often orbits around the screen. In some ways, I was looking back, I think it was a Mercedes-Benz W220 S-Class, had about 170 motors, had enormous advances in technology, but we sort of moved from sort of peak button to peak screen, or have we moved to peak button to peak screen? And I wondered if that was something that you would care to comment on.
Yes, I think you're right. I think we
There
have.
it is,
yeah.
That was the height
peak
of
button.
1999. That was the bleeding edge.
Yes, we have. I remember this era, and it was more is more. This is the time when there were more functions coming into the product, and to showcase that off, there were more buttons, right? And this is very typical of that era. Brian knows the Opel Insignia also had. I think that was the pinnacle of the amount of buttons in an interior as well. And it just became, I think what happened was people said, hey, I am so distracted. I don't know what to look at. There's just too much here. I can't absorb all this and keep my eyes on the road at the same time. And so technology with touchscreens has enabled designers to simplify this experience quite a bit. And so that's why you see more and more screens and less buttons. I know that some brands are still holding on to a few key physical switches and buttons, because I think there's still this need to try to have this physical connection with a vehicle that you can't get with just touching a screen. There's something magical about touching a knurled button or a knob or something like that. I think what's happening right now is we're now entering the pinnacle of the screen. So we're seeing screens everywhere, and they're getting bigger and wider and taller. And I think what's going to happen is we're going to be moving into another phase where user experience or user interface is going to become more diversified. It's not just going to be about the screen. There's advancements in materials that are going to enable controls to be put onto different surfaces that also respond to touch, and they aren't necessarily screens. So I think we've reached the pinnacle of the screen, and I think we're going to see much more diverse user experience set of tools to work with. Going forward, also, I think it's going to be brand driven and customer driven. You know, like you said, the Mercedes today, like the S-Class today, is just the whole thing is like a is like a touch screen, right?
Yes, like the screen.
That might be great for their customer. Their customer wants more, they want to show more and they want more. But there's other brands that are choosing to back off of that and to maybe have something other than just a touchscreen interface, and to incorporate some of these newer technologies and materials and surfaces to have a different experience, a different user experience. And I think user experience right now, we're talking about the screens primarily, but I think it's the entire experience you have with the vehicle, not just the screen experience. I know that's the big discussion today because it's the new thing, and graphics are getting more richer and more interactive and more immersive. But I think, like I said, I think we're going to see a lot more diversity in the user experience tools.
Peter, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this diversification idea.
Well, yes, and I think what I am concerned, I have to say, that like that Mercedes, all those buttons and switches, we just do the same thing on a screen. And, you know, I have to say, when the early days of Geely Design in the Shanghai studio, we'd hired a lot of very, very talented youngsters from university, and on the UI UX team, they were doing all sorts of things on the screen. And I thought, well, you know, that's too much. And I asked, and who has a driving license? No? Okay. Then we better think of that, because they're sitting at a desk designing all this stuff on a computer. And I have to remind them that you've got to operate this at 120 kilometers an hour in this period before total autonomy, if ever that comes. We've got to be careful that we don't overcomplicate things, because it is a distraction. And another thing, I mean, I speak for a certain age group who may need reading glasses when reading, but
I'm there already, I'm afraid.
drive a car perfectly well. You know, the tiny areas on the screen and the icons, they're not going to work. You know, you look away from the road and then try and find out what to press. We have to do an awful lot of work to make sure that this technology is not overdone. Or in fact, we have to create a scenario where some things switch off. You cannot use certain functions at a certain speed. As the speed increases, maybe more things disappear from the screen. But it's an issue. I think we have to be very careful with you know, this. Just because we can doesn't mean to say we should on the use of technology and the massive amount of it. Like that Mercedes is only digital.
Yes, I mean, it does seem we've traded one sort of proliferation for a different type of proliferation. I'm also interested, Peter, in this idea that where we've got a generation of, I mean, the newer generation have embraced the car far less than generations previously, but they do hold lots of skills that are needed to design a modern car. So this idea where there's a slight disconnect by people who are designing cars who don't drive them, or you know, we need to remind them of that, I suppose, every now and again.
Well, yes, it's very true. We have to make sure that the car is, or the screen is operable at speed and on a busy road. You know, in the new Lotus, we've managed, well, we've made it so that you can actually switch off the screen and it folds down, and all the controls you need are on the steering wheel, and all the information you need is on the head-up display. All electrons get a head-up display. So we have that ability to, you know, Lotus drivers, if you want to drive the car, then all you need is, you know, within reach on the steering wheel and in sight ahead on the road. So it's hands on the wheel and eyes on the road. So we're managing this, because, you know, as I said, it's just because you can do all these amazing things doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, that's
I think,
great point.
The time you get over the self-consciousness of speaking to your car, that's when you can free up an awful lot of functions.
That self-consciousness is really interesting. I still cannot bring myself to address Siri in any way, shape, or form. I don't know what it is. I have a mental block.
That's more catalyst for profanity more than anything else, as far as reliability. But I think Peter makes a great point. I think we're really maturing, and Liz knows this too. And it gets back to recruitment, the type of people that we need to have these discussions versus just designing an IP door and a console. It's the true customer experience. And, you know, in the past it was, well, this supplier would give us this and this supplier would give us this, and let's just kind of put it on an armature and hopefully it'll be a good experience. And now the expectation coupled with the need to really drive, whether it be safety, driver distraction, eyes on the road, hands on the wheel, be able to, because people still do at some level are trying to multitask, but can they do it in a safer way? And can, to Peter's point, can we do this but not do this at the same time? And there's an interesting, the textbook around the Model 3 where all that virtualization was based on cost, not on so much customer experience. So they needed those large overt offsets, and of course the whole vehicle is very overt in its trade-offs. And so if you look at kind of the influence of that, yeah, I experienced the same thing with the designers in Shanghai of the large proliferation, and then you find out most of them are bus to the office.
Yeah, I was interested to see that Tesla agreed to switch off the gaming function while you were driving. Which...
Yeah, you probably should, though, wouldn't you?
Just Shanghai traffic is not the same as anywhere else. It's very static. But
yeah, it's very static.
True. Just before we move on, just to remind you, to everyone who's tuned in, to drop your questions in the chat. There's a few coming in, which I will get to at in the conversation. But yeah, feel free to throw a question to any of our panelists here, and I will put it to them. One thing we touched on briefly there with the idea of integrating technology into materials, Liz, which I thought was an interesting thing. If we dial back the conversation to where we were 20 years ago, I wondered, what seems to be a driving material choice now is sustainability, and that's a demand from the consumer as much as anything, or we are told it's a demand from the consumer. But I wondered what the appetite was back then. Was that even a consideration, the idea of making a sustainable interior from eco-friendly materials, and how that has grown, I suppose, to become primacy, and then maybe we'll move on to the technology aspect of that after. But what was it like back then? Did anyone care? What was
20 years ago? 20 years ago, nobody cared. No, that wasn't even on the radar. But it certainly has changed. I'd say it's really changed within the last. It started, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, and now it's really accelerating. It's now forefront in the conversations with suppliers and customers and everybody. Everybody's talking about it. And there's a lot of innovation happening in this space right now. There's a lot of startup companies creating new biomaterials to address the need to become authentically sustainable, not just recycling, not just repurposing, but creating materials that can break down over time. And so, yes, it is completely changed. 20 years ago, it wasn't even on anybody's mind. I think that the first story I ever heard about sustainability was when Ford had seat cushions in their interiors that were made out of soy. And that, I don't know, was that 10, 15 years ago, maybe? At the most, 10 years ago.
And it does sound like something that people would make fun of slightly. Soy. The best word in the world.
Yes. Had its own marketing challenges, I'm sure.
Tofu seeds.
Yes. Being a fully biodegradable car. I mean, I suspect we're probably a ways off that, but it is interesting how the debate has shifted. Brian, I suppose, and Peter, this is a question for both of you, about the scalability of these kind of these new materials, because I think that's where it can be a stumbling block. You see.
Well, and I think it's putting more expectation on the designer to consider circular in the design development. Typically it's, well, let's get something that integrates and looks great, and then we'll figure out afterwards how we can tear it down, maybe what can be reused, what can be repurposed, what materials we can substitute. And I think the evolution is more thinking very much from the very beginning how we might be smarter about that instead of at the end. And I think that's I think we're right at the infancy of even how to do that. And certainly we're still very much metrics against a validation process of clinics, and those drive certain kinds of solution sets where if we really think about the pure circular nature that's required really fully deliver, then you'd probably think of things very differently from the start.
Peter, I think, would you like to jump in there?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I've realized is that it doesn't change overnight everywhere at the same time. You know, we have Europe, which is fairly well advanced in the sustainable story. America maybe a little slower, and China was perhaps even slower. Having said that, things in China change quicker than anywhere else, and we've noticed that the demand is creeping up for sustainability. But also, you know, we have to consider that there's always been a very strong vested interest in the status quo when it comes to suppliers. So that we get them to build a complete factory next door to ours and equip it with all the tooling and material and equipment to produce a certain type of IP or whatever. And then if we come along and say, oh, we don't want that one at this time, we want something totally different, they'll say, hold on, we've just spent billions setting up shop to make this. We'll expect one or two more. You know, that sort of is part of it. I think that the motor industry seem to be a bit slow to change, and there's good reason. But I think, as you said, Elizabeth, the startups are coming in without any history and being able to create new materials. It's strange though, when, you know, way back, fabric or cloth seats were the cheap versions, and leather was obviously the more expensive. But I think you know, we're certainly in Lotus, we're using wool and man-made fiber to try and replace that up to a point.
I'm going to sort of go to sort of audience questions now, because we've been going a little bit, and there are a few coming in. Liz, first one is for you, and it regards education, because I think this link between industry and education is crucial, and you are a cog, a substantial cog in that big machine. And this is from Peter Davis, and he's asking, how is interior design taught at LTU to meet the demand of the industry?
Oh, interesting. Peter, he's my co-director at LTU.
Oh, well, full transparency
that? It's just so funny. Hey, Peter.
Maybe I shouldn't have
Peter. So Peter and I actually both came from interior design. So of course we have some built-in expertise there and also some affinity for it and know how important it is. So we have emphasized in every one of our projects, when we do our projects, we emphasize both the interior and the exterior. We also have redesigned the whole curriculum so that we have 2 independent interior design studios that are completely focused on interior design. And then what we do is, as the students become seniors, we let them define what direction they're going to go into, whether it be interior or exterior, and they do their thesis project based on that direction. So quite a bit of emphasis between Peter and I putting this new curriculum together, so that the students are, you know, we have students who go right into interior design when they graduate. They're recruited for interior design. In fact, I think the majority of our students today are graduating with interior jobs.
This one is still related to students actually, but this probably maybe this is for you and Brian and Peter. This is another student a student, and they're studying the Art Center College of Design in LA, and they're focused on interior UX and CMF design, but they're curious as to how to make their interior design portfolio stand out. Now, I know you guys are quite a long way up the chain in terms of recruiting. You probably wouldn't be recruiting sort of junior interior designers, but I wondered, I mean, obviously you both have a very keen understanding of what is required these days. So how can you stand out among the crowd? Brian, I'll start with you, then Peter, I'll go to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you know, it's I'm amazed at the tools now today that the students have access to and are able to leverage. So the portfolios are quite outstanding visually, can be. I think what we're typically trying to look for is the thinking process and how that's being illustrated. And I think now, like we've been kind of talking, is are they considering the user experience, and how do you? But that's hard to articulate. It's hard to visualize. So how do you go about telling that story through different types of mediums? Can you animate a little? Can you build a little? And along with, you know, the most artful integration. Many times, you know, it would be back in the day, you'd sketch something, then you'd figure out how to fit all the parts. And I think now that to Liz's point, that customer experience, that total experience is so significant, is to show that not only can I illustrate, not only can I think about the aesthetic, but I'm equally prioritizing the true functionality and integrating them together. And the more you can kind of visually explain that story, I think the more promise there is.
Great stuff, Peter.
Yeah. To be honest, for the last couple of years, we have depended on virtual reality, on VR, to continue our projects, because obviously with colleagues in China making decisions, they couldn't travel, we couldn't travel there. And we could, of course, create machine models, both sides, but the simple solution was to put on the headset, and I'd be sitting in the passenger seat of a car that doesn't exist, sitting next to the chairman who's in Shanghai. We see each other as avatars, you might know. And in the back, there's Ben, the chief designer in the Coventry studio, and we're talking about the interior, the whole design. Once you've made a model, a digital model, you can actually show it in VR. And I would suggest that with the accessibility of VR for students, it's possible that you know, if you get the interviewer to don the headset and show what you've done, that would be a fantastic way of doing it. And you can take your headset around to different places. The clay model would be tough, but I think that would be my suggestion, that if they can, let's get into VR as quickly as possible. It saved the day for us, and it's very impressive.
Yeah,
that's a brilliant point, Pete. Sorry, come on, Liz.
I was going to say, right on, Peter. Totally agree. We were in the same situation during the lockdowns, and we relied on Zoom and we relied on Gravity Sketch. Which is a tool that our students use. That's a VR tool where they create their designs in 3D. Are you familiar with that, Peter?
Gravity, no.
Okay, I think Brian might be.
Yeah, Gravity Sketch. We've been most of those test cases have been in the advanced space, and as you know, the acumen for the younger new hires is much higher. And but it's it's very interesting because you can build in 3D. And get into that environment. So I just experienced that not too long ago on a review, and I think it's an excellent point that Peter makes, because you know, as the proliferation grows, we should see more and more of this at the desktop level as far as a tool, and certainly the pandemic catalyzed it. So but yeah, you can, you know, and that's what I would have wanted as a student. Hey, this is the experience I want to create. Now I can build some of that and sit you in it. That would have been a huge advantage to me when I was in school.
Yeah, so scale models of interiors never really work. By the way, I have to say, we may be using Gravity. It's just that I probably haven't been told. No, they probably think
that's the way it was with me. We've been using it for years, Brian. Okay.
Peter, actually, while you mention that and the clay model itself, I wonder just if I could, what do you think of the future of that? Is that still going to be a skill? I've heard, you know, people say it's essential still to the design process, but I wondered what your take is, given the advent of all this technology, whether we're going to see it fade out, or is it going to be something that we like vinyl records, they continue to find their value?
Yeah, I think that they will probably come later and later in the program. The more we can do without them, then it's probably going to save some time and cost. But you know, I have to say that sitting in an interior is still still has a value. The VR is sort of 85% of the way there, but I think, as I said, at the end of the day, you probably want to sit in something.
Touching still on a similar subject, but this is about AR, and one of the audiences asked whether AR could be the solution to decluttering the IP and screens. Liz, maybe Brian, then Liz, perhaps, or Peter. Brian,
yeah, I think some of the latest studies, it was kind of funny back when I was in Shanghai. We had done a Chevy F&R concept, and it was just this crazy concept, but the interior was fully autonomous, and all that was left was the seat. So I said, well, you better spend a lot of time on that seat because everything else is automated. But I think it's, again, back to this experience, and designing for the experience is critical. And figuring out what's the high use cases relative to that experience versus low use cases. Can this really be verbal? Is that the most convenient way to do that, the safest? Is there something I want to physically touch and engage with? Is there another way relative to heads-up display or eye tracking where I can interface, but maybe it's low fidelity versus high fidelity interaction? I mean, the steering wheel is now more and more of the MFC of the vehicle moving forward. And so how do I interact, whether I have things in my touch zone or I'm remoting things? What's the frequency of that, the best way to do that? And then, to Liz's point and Peter's point, can I brand that experience to make it somewhat unique? I'd hate to see the day where we're all just like our iPhones. It's all one common solution set. And I'm really hoping that the community will continue to develop what can be a little more characteristic of that brand, a little more characteristic in the experience, and not shy away from some of those unique things that might separate the brands at some level as that experience.
A related point, sort of adjacent, I suppose, from another of the audience, and it's slightly long, but it's worth bearing with me. Future customers who may be kids now may not get to experience long-term ownership of car, making do with or preferring a subscription model of participation with frequent vehicle changes. Will this make vehicle interiors more utilitarian or more ebullient? I think that's quite an interesting question. Free for all, who wants to jump in on that one? Liz, I'll put you on the spot.
Okay. I think there's going to be more bandwidth, because if people can choose what they want, I think there's going to be more offerings. Companies are going to compete to want to get that subscription holder or subscription person to subscribe to them. And so I think there's going to be more bandwidth, because the reason why those subscriptions have been out there is because people have different needs depending on their day, right? As far as the type of vehicle they want. One day they might need a pickup truck because they need to haul something. The next day they might want a sports car because they're going out and they want to show themselves off or whatever. So I think that would afford more options, more design opportunities, not less. That's my opinion. I don't have a crystal ball, but that's what I'm thinking.
It's a pretty good one, though. Peter, more is more? Is it just more?
Well, I remember way back when we did the Volvo 480, we went to America with it, and we told people, this is what you need. This is a sports car and a station wagon in one car. That's all you need. And the respondents just said, well, if I want a sports car, I'll buy a sports car. If I want a station wagon, I'll buy a station wagon and a truck and an SUV. It was, completely different thought process between Sweden, Holland, and America. But obviously we've got subscription running at Lincoln Co. right now. It seems to be doing very well. People are going into it. I don't know if I would ever do it. If I had a car which was shared or used by a lot of people, I'd want a hose down interior probably. It's whatever you think. I mean, if people are not considering the ownership of a car as something special, but I still do, and I don't know. It will change, no doubt. But they're there. These subscription deals you can get anywhere now.
True.
Whether it affects the design, apart from that cleanability thing, I'm not sure.
I do quite enjoy this question because I see these kind of ideas put forward quite a lot. But this is a question relating to autonomy, and I'll throw this one over to you, Brian. Is there an engaging alternative to the living room, quote, living room with wheel on 4 wheels in the autonomous age? I think I mentioned it when we all met that often I see concepts, and what they seem to have in common is a very, very sort of no steering wheel and a pot plant, and I in the graphic renders. So I'm curious, Brian, as to what is the alternatives to this idea of a living room for you?
Yeah, we think about this a lot, especially in the advanced space, and some of the ideas around, can I really, if I'm in an old convertible with a 5-speed and a good day on a good road, can you really maybe create that type of enjoyment in an autonomous world, in an autonomous chauffeur-driven vehicle, in a sense, and can you create something exciting to engage with? And there's been a lot of pondering about what that means. And so, like one of our studies, Interspace, which is again more of a destination solution. You're with someone special, you go for an overnight at someplace you aspire to, and how do you equip it to get there? And but with that, then can you create any kind of enthusiasm from that might be that you missed from the past? And it's interesting to see, and I think some of it may be generational, some of it may be just how things. I'm still shocked today how one of my daughters is a big gamer, and I just it's hard for me to identify with. And yet there's such an emotional pull for her as far as those games. And so for her, it'll be, hey, great, put me on autopilot, and I'm just going to go into gamification mode for the rest of this route.
Yeah.
And so that's been one of the dialogues we've been having is what's the interfaces, what's the interaction to drive to maybe in some ways substitute, in some ways it's just a new experience altogether, and what's the environment to create that new experience. And ultimately in the Interspace, it was developing how many experiences can you create in one space, and really managing a multi-sensory experience, engaging all your senses in a controlled way to create different types of experiences.
Interesting. I think the idea of plugging in and playing games on a route to me is it's very foreign. That's a very alien idea. Would anyone else like to jump in on that, Peter or Liz?
Oh, well, I think one thing that I keep seeing is this, as you call it, living room, where the front seats are facing backwards. If all roads are dead straight, that might be perfectly okay, but they're not. And we did an autonomous vehicle for a client, and they insisted that the seats faced forwards because in their experience, there was an issue of motion sickness. When the train goes in a straight line, more or less, planes do, you can sit backwards in both of them. But cars is a different thing because of the roads aren't necessarily straight. So things like that, I'm not sure if we will be seeing that. The other thing is, of course, anything that moves in traffic is a potential hazard. So all the safety regulations, as far as I know, will still remain intact, so that you can't put plant pots, anything that is moving. If I was designing a Volvo, and if I suggested even a depression on the top of the IP and say, well, that's where you could put your SLR camera, or the engineers would have a heart attack, because in a crash, which they always consider, that is a lethal weapon. So all the rules still apply. So I don't see it completely changing. The living room, perhaps not. But
I'm quite relieved then, because I've hard enough time keeping my pot plants alive at home, let alone space between Liz, your thoughts on the? I think we'll wrap up with you because we've been going a while now. But the alternative to the living room spaces.
Yes, no, I agree with Peter and Brian on this. The one that cracks me up is the yoga studio on wheels. I don't know. I've heard that as an idea, but yeah, it's still a moving object, right? And you're still going to feel the forces of the movement. And I personally get car sick. If I'm not driving, I get car sick. I just don't see how that's going to happen for the majority of the population. Now, if it's a low speed situation and you're just in the city mode and you're driving at lower than 30 miles an hour and it's just short distances with like a cruise, that's fine. But beyond that, it's going to be a challenge. Maybe I'm a dinosaur and I just don't see it, but I just, knowing physics and knowing how things move, I have a hard time understanding how you're going to have potted plants in a yoga studio in your interior.
No, agreed. Okay, I'm glad we're finishing on a sort of understanding of physics note, which is quite important given the industry. Okay, well, guys, we've overrun slightly, but it was very interesting, so I'm more than happy to do that. Just to say to anyone who's been tuning in, there will be a special offer for the Interior Motors, and there you get a sneak peek of the brand new logo. It's been redesigned. It's coming out twice a year, so if you want to get subscription to Interior Motors on its print return, there it is. Follow the link there and you'll get 50% off. But shameless plug aside, I'd just like to thank our guests today who've been really, really fascinating and generous with their time. And they are Elizabeth Wetzel, Brian Nesbitt and Peter Horbury. We hope to see you at the next physical event. Maybe some of you are going to Goodwood, I don't know. Peter, I might see you there. Liz, Brian, perhaps not. But anyway, it's been lovely to have you with us and we will speak to you soon, I'm sure. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure.